All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nicole, and this is a little bit of an overdue community meeting for us. We haven't had one in a couple months. But the good news for today is that last week we were able to publish PatternFly 5. So PatternFly 5 is live, and that's primarily what we're going to talk about today, and primarily why we haven't had a community meeting in a while, because we have been all hands on deck working for months to get it out. So yeah, we got a lot to catch you up on, especially on what's in PatternFly 5, and I'm happy to dig into that a little bit. So start with I'll start before I even get into why migrate to PatternFly 5 and what's in it. Acknowledging that the slides themselves already even look a little bit different, because with PatternFly 5 has come a little bit of a rebranding of PatternFly, an update to the logo, and some new styles and branding. So that's exciting. We'll get into some of the changes you might see on the website related to that. But yeah, we're entering a new era for PatternFly, I guess. So want to call that out. I even have a cool little PatternFly necklace now that has the new logo on it. I'm probably really tiny because I'm showing my screen, but it's there. The new logo on it. So we're excited about all the changes. But okay, PatternFly 5. So it's the first major release we've had of PatternFly in years. So it's primarily a technical release in terms of the breaking changes. The notable changes are primarily more on the technical side and less so on the design side. So sometimes when that happens, it makes it a little less obvious to an outside observer what the big changes are and what the value add really is. Because when everything looks different, that's more easy to see. So we'll dig into a little bit about really what are some of the technical enhancements and changes that were made for V5 and why people should add migrating to V5 to the roadmap. This list is not exhaustive, but some of the highlights in terms of technical changes or enhancements made that are part of V5. One, it supports React 18. It also supports React 17, the latest 2 versions of React. It also introduced federated modules to enable smaller bundle sizes. So products who use that as part of their build can absolutely take advantage of this new feature. We also are releasing, we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but we're updating more flexible, more lightweight implementations of some of our most popular components. So that includes wizards, select, drop-down table, a couple others even. Hopefully that will mean that as products, as complex use cases grow ever more complex, you'll be able to adapt more easily these very popular components to a more variety of components, and more variety of use cases without us having to continually bake in more and more complexity into the components themselves, which makes them fragile. So we're excited about that. V5 comes with many accessibility improvements, a more consistent API, especially in this case of form elements, which will hopefully enable products to incorporate third-party state management and validation libraries, things like that. We also have at least one, maybe even 2, and more in conversation, extensions to allow products to share complex, more opinionated implementations of PatternFly and implementations of specific use cases across products more simply. So as those get developed, they're all being developed in PatternFly 5. So if you want to take advantage of some of the latest and greatest shared extensions, you're going to need to migrate to PatternFly 5. It also does lay the groundwork for streamlined adoption of PatternFly's future new look and feel. So I mentioned that this release is not a design emphasized release in terms of a large design enhancements or design refresh, but we are talking about one. So this was a key release for us to lay groundwork for that adoption being smoother and more streamlined and strategic. So if you're going to want to take advantage of that in the future, that being the new look and feel possibly, that's a reason to try to get onto PatternFly 5 as soon as you can. One of the big updates with this release is the fact that PatternFly is modifying some of its processes, taking advantage of this sort of disruption to our normal workflow to evaluate if there's better ways we can go about some of our processes. One of the things we are updating is we are going to be moving toward an annual major release cadence. So I mentioned before that the last major release was over 3 years ago, which in software is just a millennium. So we are going to allow ourselves to be a little bit more agile and able to adapt to new customer needs. We are going to be hopefully releasing a major release every year, and the major release will hopefully be not quite as grand because we won't have had so much buildup of issues we'd like to address. So the backlog will not be as overwhelming. And it will also help us to maintain clearer timelines and manage priorities on a shorter time scale. That being said, it's worth noting that PatternFly is committed to maintaining the latest 2 major versions of PatternFly at all times. So one of the fears products have been asking us is, how long will you be supporting PatternFly for? And the reality is we're not planning to further enhance PatternFly 4, add any new features or anything like that. But we are committed to addressing high priority issues as they arise, at least until our next major release. That would be PatternFly 6, available hopefully around this time next year because of our new annual release cadence there. Another change to our process is historically, PatternFly has had a release at the end of each one of our 3-week sprints. And rather than doing that, in an effort to make sure that it's not too difficult to fall far behind on our releases as they come out, but also in order to kind of craft a better adoption story, a better value add for each of our releases, we're going to switch to releasing every quarter. So each quarterly release will have a theme, a story to hopefully motivate adoption and help products have an easier path to staying up to date with PatternFly. That does not mean, so we are absolutely able to still release patch releases or bug fix releases as needed more frequently than every quarter. But each quarter will be a feature release, non-breaking feature release. Our first planned post PatternFly 5 release will be at the end of Q3 for the PatternFly team. And as of right now, the story, the feature ad for the next quarterly release is going to center around the concept of right to left language support, but we'll get into that a little bit more in the future as well. And so what this boils down to here is that basically every year we'll have a major release, a breaking change release, and then every quarter between those major releases we'll have a feature release that is non-breaking. And each feature release will have a theme and a story to drive and motivate adoption or migration. I'll also note that I think at a previous community meeting, we dug in a little bit to what our testing and release process looks like. So I won't dig into that right now, but I just want to remind everybody that every single time, when it was the 3-week sprint cadence and going forward when it's a little bit less frequent, every release includes testing of our release candidates in multiple Red Hat products to mitigate introduction of breaking changes as much as we're able. So that will still be true going forward. Okay. hopefully that was a little bit motivating to stay up to date and reap the benefits of all the things added in V5. But the question now is how? So how do we migrate to PatternFly 5? We do have quite a number of resources that we have provided to hopefully aid in that migration. I want to remind everybody that's here and watching later that the PatternFly team is incredibly active on Slack and will respond to any questions we get as quickly as we can. We highly, highly, highly encourage products to not wrestle or struggle with PatternFly too long on your own without reaching out to us. We would love to partner with you, answer questions, address issues you're finding as quick as we can. So that's the first call out. The second resource here is our release highlights. I should actually update this slide. It was a draft until last week, so I can update this to be the published version of our release highlights, that link in the slide here. But basically, if you go to patternfly.org, you can find under the Getting Started nav item the release highlights for everything that's been introduced in PatternFly 5, a high-level overview of what's there. So that's worth a read if you aren't familiar with all of the things added in V5. We also on the website have published an upgrade guide. It's a comprehensive upgrade guide, includes instructions on how we recommend approaching the PatternFly 5 migration, instructions on how to run code mods, how to update CSS selectors, and more. So I would highly recommend anyone who's beginning the process to start by looking at the upgrade guide. We also have, as a tab on the upgrade guides page, release notes. So this is a searchable, filterable view of all breaking changes included in PatternFly 5. So as a product is migrating, hopefully you can take advantage of this table to aid in understanding error messages or build issues that you might be running into because of the breaking changes. And I mentioned the code mods, but I wanted to definitely highlight the resource that they are here. So code mods are a tool that you can run on your code base, and it will identify the breaking changes that you're going to need to make on your code base to migrate to PatternFly 5. And in the case where it's able to make the changes for you, you are able to run them with the fix flag, and they'll be made for you. The PatternFly team worked very hard on the code mods. There are over 130 code mods that are collectively that collectively compose this tool. So I definitely recommend products take advantage of it. And like I said, the instructions for how to run them are in the upgrade guide. There's also much, much more information in the README in the source code if you're interested as well. I'll make one other note, since I've heard some products chattering about the fact that we did deprecate some components with our PatternFly 5 release. There are quite a number of old implementations of some of our components that we have sort of readdressed to provide new implementations for in PatternFly 5. So in every case, when a component was deprecated, there is a new recommended solution that you can use to implement the old features, the old components. When you run your code mods, any instances of deprecated components are not going to be removed. They're not even going to be flagged as something you need to fix immediately to migrate to PatternFly 5. What they would do is they would actually update your import paths to pull from like deprecated directories within our PatternFly packages so that those deprecated components will work as before. So the code for these deprecated components still exists in PatternFly 5. You can still use it. Our recommendation is that as you run code mods, as you manually migrate to PatternFly 5, you update usage of your deprecated components to point to the deprecated directory in our packages and note that so that maybe as a follow-up to PatternFly 5 migration, once you're done and moved completely onto PatternFly 5 and everything is working fine, you can go back and readdress those deprecated components in the future, because it is not a prerequisite that you fully stopped using the deprecated components to call yourselves PatternFly 5 migrated. I hope that makes sense. I don't want anyone to be discouraged by the fact or refuse to migrate to PatternFly 5 because they know we've they're making use of our deprecated components. We know that products use them a lot, and that's part of the reason why they needed a re-implementation. So they're still there for use, and you can still use them for now, and that's not step one of migrating to V5. The last call out I will personally make is about, along with some of this rebranding that the PatternFly team has done as part of the PatternFly 5 release, it did come with a pretty extensive website update. So I want to highlight some of the work that was done on the website. First and foremost being our new homepage. So the homepage definitely has gotten a facelift. It looks much different than it did before. It's a little bit more emphasizing some call to actions and highlights. One of the things that highlights right off the bat is the fact that we've officially exposed the documentation for our dark theme as part of PatternFly 5. So the dark theme itself isn't new, but we had never exposed the documentation for it before. Now you can toggle the whole PatternFly website and see what it looks like in dark theme and find information about how to implement it if you haven't done so before. It also features some of our, which is cut off into screenshots here, but our Medium blog posts. So one of which right now being about PatternFly 5. So there's more information there if you're curious. Also throughout the site, we have a number of new, we're calling them landing pages. They're almost like catalog views of our components or of our various library features. We have under the component section on the nav, an all components page where you can view little images, sort of giving you a hint at what these components might be used for or what they look like, and hopefully an easier way to browse and find components if you need that, because we know we have a very, very long list of components. So this is an exciting new feature, is the all components page, and landing pages like the all components page exist under most of our sub-nav items now. So I have here a screenshot of the one from the patterns page, which lists a lot of our more complex like demos or patterns. Extensions, layouts, a lot of those all have landing pages like this now too. So hopefully that makes things a little bit clearer and easier to find if you aren't sure what these sections are intended to be used for. And as you navigate the website, we'd love to hear what you all think. Another thing I wanted to mention, it's hard to capture this in a screenshot. I did my best. Our side nav on the website has historically been rather flat, especially our long list of components listed in the side nav. What we've tried to do with this website upgrade is group some of the related components into a tertiary subnav. So one of the most popular questions I have gotten the first day since PatternFly was live is, where did the select documentation go? Because a lot of people are interested in seeing the new select implementation. And I say, oh, it's been grouped with other select like components because we actually have quite a few of them. And they're all under the menus section because all of these components use a menu. We also have a group of components grouped under forms and date and time. We have a couple file upload components. So before you panic that something's been removed, I don't think any components have been fully removed from PatternFly, from this nav item, these nav items at all. Some of them are grouped a little bit differently, but if you have trouble finding things, let us know. And if you think that this is not working, also let us know. Making it too hard to find things. Hopefully it'll make it easier. It just takes a tiny bit of getting used to. Another website update worth noting is that we've updated all of our URLs on the site because historically the patternfly.org URLs used v4 in the URL itself. So we wanted to remove all references to Patternfly 4 from the URLs, and which means that we're working on getting the redirecting working just right. It's not quite working exactly the way we hoped, but hopefully it'll be fixed before long. And anytime you use a v4 in a URL, you will get redirected to a helpful site, a helpful page. But for now, just keep in mind, if you're seeing an error that this page doesn't exist anymore, it's probably because it still has a v4 in the URL that needs to be removed. We also did move all of the PatternFly 4 documentation into a new archived PatternFly 4 site. So it still exists. You still view it all running as it was before v5 was released. You can get to it most easily by going to our version switcher on the masthead of patternfly.org and looking at the previous versions and clicking on PatternFly 4. But it's still there. So. All right, I think that's all the website updates I have. Does anybody have any questions about anything I've said so far? All right. Then I will pass off this torch to Michael Coker so he can give us a little bit of a core team update on some of the cool work done by the core team for PatternFly 5.
Thank you. You can go ahead and go to the next slide if you don't mind.
Sure.
I don't think I need to show anything here, but if folks have questions and they want to see anything that I'm mentioning or want some more info on it, just raise your hand in the meet or interrupt me and we can look at it. But I'll just give a brief overview of some notable changes that were made. So pretty cool. It's a great opportunity to have a breaking and the breaking change releases. It's so great because we can introduce changes that we've been wanting to make for quite a while, especially as the technology evolves and all of that. So we began implementing gap where, and by gap, I mean CSS gap, specifically in flex layouts, because that wasn't the most well-supported feature up until relatively recently, at least for the browsers that we're concerned about. So all of our layouts that were the simple put stuff beside each other on top of each other kind of layouts that we have, they have a gutter option. I think it's like a has gutter prop on these React components that was previously or were previously using margin to space the elements from one another to create the gutter, and now those are using gap. So that's pretty awesome. The next bullet is the flex layout. So that's the other layout that really needed that. And the flex layout's the Swiss Army knife of putting boxes by other boxes and creating space and stacking and rowing things. And so that layout, it has a spacing system that is pretty versatile and existed previously that uses margins to create the space between items. That spacing system still exists because it serves some purposes that we can't quite do just using gap currently, specifically around having variable gap between items that are all part of the same parent-child relationship in the flex layout. But there is a new feature, a new spacing system available with the flex layout that is just gap. So use that, check it out. Everything's responsive and viewport size based if you want. So you can specify either gap, a column gap, a row gap, both. You could use the margin system on one axis and gap on the other. And you can switch all of those at the various viewport breakpoints that we support and have built into the component. So it's a couple of new fancy props in the React component that you can check out and let us know how that works out. The page component, previously, because of some lowest common denominator of needing to work on, I think, Safari on mobile, iOS, we were not able to use viewport height units or viewport units to size the page component to make it fill the height of the viewport. And the best method that we had to do that previously was assigning height 100% to the page component, which requires every ancestor element of the page component, the div that has class PFC page, every element above it up to you get to the body element of your document needed to also have height 100%, because that's how height works in CSS. It's kind of weird. And with viewport units, you can just say, hey, put this div that's in the middle of my page, make it as high as the viewport is, which is awesome. That's a really cool feature. So there's a new way that you can specify viewport units. We're using standard height 100 VH as well as height 100 DVH, which is a technique that handles other odd use cases that height 100 VH doesn't support. So basically, the page component now uses viewport height units to size itself. And so products, if they want, they don't believe you have to do this, but if you want, you could take off height 100% from any elements that are outside of or ancestors of the page component. So that's probably something you have in your CSS that you could remove if you want, which is always great. The next bullet point is pretty cool. Should be fairly invisible to most folks, but we did have some instances where we have these global reset and normalized styles that basically give us a flat beginning for all styles of all elements on the page. And so it does things like remove the padding and margin and borders and whatnots from everything that exists on the page. Any kind of markup that would be in the page comes with default styles from a browser. We want to get rid of that because we want to have some pretty strict styling over all of those elements when we create the CSS for PatternFly. In doing that, the way that we would remove those styles is just writing normal CSS that does that, and that relies upon all of your subsequent styles that you want to restyle those elements to be loaded after these normalize and reset styles. And there were instances where our normalize and reset styles would get loaded after the PatternFly styles, PatternFly component styles, and those reset styles would nuke the PatternFly component styles, and it would remove the margins and paddings and all of that, just because the order of those styles was out of the order that we were expecting. And so anyways, there's a new feature in CSS where you can drop what's called the specificity of a rule. So basically the prominence of that rule, or how important it really is in terms of overriding anything else. And we've reduced the specificity of all of those styles down to 0, which means that they should override the browser's defaults, but they're not going to override any other PatternFly styles, regardless of the order that you put the reset and normalized styles in. So that's pretty cool. The next bullet point is we have a standalone checkbox and radio variants, or a variant of the checkbox and radio component called standalone. That's just a checkbox, or it's just a radio. It's not a label or anything fancy. It's just that little form element. That's a relatively new feature. And so between the last breaking change and this breaking change, we introduced that. And but we have a lot of components that we're still using regular inputs, just a checkbox or just a radio. And it's not the PatternFly component for a checkbox or radio. And we were able to, in this release, replace all instances of those with the standalone variant. And so now all of the checks and the radios that we use across PatternFly components, regardless of how simple or complex they are using our checkbox and radio component, which is great. Form control, which in core speak translates to the React components that are text input, text area, and form select. So just these browser-supported form elements, basically. We have status icons for those. If you had like an invalid or a success state of any of those, you get like a red attention bell icon or a big green check mark icon, that kind of thing inside of the element to indicate its status. And previously, because of the way we were styling those elements in a very minimalistic way, the images were, or the icons rather, that indicated status were created as data URIs as a background image to that form element. And that's chock full of problems, all kinds of stuff. One was, and we had a handful of products report this, was that they have content security policies in their application that prohibit data URIs as paths to images in the document for some reasons. And so we ended up having to create a sprite variation of these icons to where it's not an embedded icon. It's like an externally hosted icon file that you could then reference. Anyways, we ended up dropping that background image portion and even the sprite variant entirely. And now we reworked the HTML for these form elements such that we can just include regular icons there. So they're just normal icons that we would include just like in any other component. So those are updated now. That's pretty cool. The about modal box and the background image components used to ship with default background images because there is a design expectation that both of those would have some sort of a logo for your application as the background image for those. And those were also the two places in PatternFly CSS that we were shipping paths to images as background images. And we had, again, a number of products report this as an issue, specifically in the context of trying to use parcel.js as a tool, and it was parsing the PatternFly CSS, and it's complaining about the way that PatternFly specifies relative paths to the background image property, specifically in these two places. There wasn't a very clear, clean workaround that we had, but we realized the images that we're shipping with those are really just placeholders anyways. They're PatternFly images, and applications aren't going to put a PatternFly image as the background image. So we just took those out. You can still configure those if you want with your own image path, but the default image paths don't exist anymore. So we're no longer shipping any image path as a background image in our CSS, which means that maybe among other things, parcel.js should be able to cleanly compile PatternFly CSS or cleanly parse it, and with no errors about that issue that we had before. The helper text component is something that we've introduced between the last major release and this one as well. And any component that needed to have helper text before we had the helper text component just had its own instance of helper text. And so we had probably 3 or 4 different components that all supported individual helper text, but it's the same exact thing in each component. And so we ended up making the helper text component because it makes sense. And so in this last release, we dropped the support for the individual helper text and those components that had their own. And now they support just using the helper text component for helper text now. So that's pretty good. And then lastly, it's kind of a general update, but we ended up reworking a handful of components that had sort of a limiting non-flexible structure for certain parts of the component. So maybe didn't quite have like enough divs or something wrapping elements so that you could group things appropriately or have options to be able to group things differently and make things more flexible. Maybe the structure of the component the HTML structure of the component was out of date compared to the way that we're doing things currently from the time that component was originally built. And so anyways, the input group, the card header, the pop-upper component, and the empty state all have a bit of a refactor to the HTML structure. Nothing mind-blowing by any means, but there are some updates to the way those are structured, and maybe there's a little bit more flexibility for being able to style and configure and position things and that sort of stuff. So the links on this slide are links to the PRs for any of these features. So feel free to dig in if you're curious, or if you run into issues, that'd probably be a good place to start. And then, of course, if you have any questions, just reach out to us. Like Nicole said, we're real active on Slack, so the team would be eager to help out.
Could I also ask you to super quick talk a little bit about our CSS prefixing that's introduced to PatternFly 5?
Yeah, good call. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that here. So basically, we ended up adding a version number to everything that the style sheets from PatternFly are going to need to style and target with styles regarding all of our components and that sort of thing. And so to cut to the end of that story a bit, all of our class names and CSS variable names, now instead of starting with .pf dash C dash button, for example, for the Patternfly component button, the button component class, and then any of the variables, CSS variables for button would be dash dash p pf dash c dash button dash dash, you know, background color, that kind of deal. We recognize that with this release, we're going to have products that are going to be running. They're going to need to run concurrently in the same application, the same page often. Patternfly 4 components and Patternfly 5 components, or maybe they have a Patternfly 4 app and they want to start updating to Patternfly 5 components within the app, or vice versa. They're going to update to Patternfly 5 and they're going to support old Patternfly 4 components that they haven't been able to migrate just yet. With the breaking change, of course, the nature of the breaking change is that the class names and the variable names and all that sort of stuff, they're going to break in their function, whether they exist or not anymore. We're going to have old Patternfly 4 styles with the same class names as new Patternfly 5 and all of that. And so it'd be pretty darn difficult, if not impossible, to run 4 and 5 together without some level of management of separating the way that the styles are associated with the markup in the page between 4 and 5. And so, as Nicole's brought up here, we've got a page on the website that basically just shows the change that was made to introduce the version number in the class names and the variable names and that sort of thing. Probably the most important thing in this table that you'll see here is the first row and the last row. The other stuff, for the most part, is going to be behind the scenes. So the first row is our CSS variables. And so that's kind of the API for interacting with the Patternfly styles. You can grab the CSS variable for any component, you know, the button background color, for example, and you can set it to red if you want. You can just declare that variable. And then the class names, that's going to be the actual class names associated with HTML elements. That'd be another good API for the styles, is folks will write out PF, you know, C button and then background color red, that kind of thing. So with V5, everything has a V5 after the PF. So all of our var names are PF dash V5 dash C dash button instead of PF dash C dash button. And HTML class names follow suit. It's PF V5 C button. The one note that I'll make about the HTML class names is that it excludes the PFM classes, because those are modifier classes that are always attached to a .pf-v5-c- button. And so since the main class, the pf-v5-c button, is already versioned, the modifier classes do not need to be versioned. They're going to only be attached to something that is versioned. And so they're not going to introduce this conflict of CSS and styles that this is ultimately designed to fix. So that's the one exclusion there. So if you run into issues where, hey, my overrides aren't working anymore because I have a bunch of CSS vars or class names in a style sheet that are changing the way things look and feel, and you realize that you're still targeting PFC button or whatever that is, you need to update those strings to PF-v5 C button. You'd want to be sure and exclude anything that's PF-M-. Don't update that to PF-v5-M- because that's not going to work. So yeah, that's basically that. Are there any questions about that?
All right. Thank you, Michael. We can now pivot over and hand it off to Tatani to talk about some of the changes on the React side that you can find in V5. Would you like to share, or would you like me to keep sharing my screen, Tatani?
You can keep sharing, Nicole. Thanks. All right, so some of these changes Nicole has already mentioned in her presentation earlier about some of the big highlights of PF5. So the first one is the React dating support. And then we also, a big change was consistent callbacks. So Nicole also covered this as well. So we updated our APIs for our callbacks, so they're more consistent with passing the event parameter always and as the first parameter. So that means, industry standards, it makes it easier to integrate with third-party libraries. And another big change that was also mentioned was we have some new solutions for some of our components, and we've deprecated the old components. So the deprecated components would be the wizard, select, dropdown, and what was called the legacy table, and the page header component. So all of these have new recommended solutions. And then, as part of the cleanup with the breaking changes, we went ahead and removed some props that had been marked deprecated already. And there have been some updates and some prop names throughout the code base to be more consistent. Just do some cleanup there. And a lot of those will have code mods to update those for you. And then to touch on some of the component changes that are notable. We had the card where we refactored the header API. I think Michael touched on this in his presentation, but we did make some API changes there, and it should be a more intuitive API to use the card header now. We also updated the selectable card API with a new design. And these links are the PRs that introduced those changes. The about modal, it used to have its own implementation of a modal, but now it's been updated to actually use the modal component. Then the empty state was refactored as well, because there's some updates to the HTML structure. So the empty state was refactored and the API has changed. Next slide, please. Okay, and the form group component has changed as well. There were several props for the form group that we had that were used to build a helper text for the form group. But now, instead of doing that, we're just passing in a helper text component. Then the input group has also changed. Previously, we had input group text, and everything else was just a child of the input group and not wrapped in anything. But now all children of input group should be wrapped. So if it's not input group text, it should be wrapped in input group item. The label has been updated. We previously had is truncated prop, and that has been removed. So now the default behavior of the label is to truncate the text when necessary. Then we have added some support to the menu. So our menu item now supports tooltips. And by adding that change, we're able to add tooltips to the new dropdown as well, which is built from the menu. And the next change was with the overflow menu. It has now been updated to use the new dropdown rather than the old dropdown implementation. A big change that you see in a lot of components is remove find DOM node prop, because that behavior is now built in by default to our components. The next change is page. We refactored the page sidebar API. The nav property has been renamed to children, and any content passed to the property should be wrapped in a page sidebar body. The spinner has been updated to remove the is SVG prop, because now all spinners are SVG. And then the wizard was updated, not only to have a new implementation of the wizard, but the buttons in the footer of the wizard have been updated. So the ordering is different now. The order the next and back buttons were updated so that the back button is now first. So those are some of the bigger, more notable changes in the React repo. And there are a lot more changes, but to see a comprehensive list of what we changed, you can click on the link to the release notes. Yeah, so those are some of the big changes that I wanted to highlight. Are there any questions about anything that's changed in React repo?
We're cutting close to the top of the hour, and I want to leave a little time for Sarah. But the other thing I am curious if you want to touch on is the new clickable selectable card. That's a new feature. That's kind of one of the biggest design enhancements any component got, I think, for V5, maybe.
Sure. Didn't really prepare for this, but see. I hope I should present it. Or who worked on the selectable card? If they're here, they can maybe talk about it more. Was that Austin or Eric?
I helped both Sarah and one of our interns in React work on it, so I could briefly go over it if you'd like.
Yeah, do you mind just going over it a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Let me.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I take over presenting, Nicole?
Not at all. Go for it.
Okay. I'll try to keep it relatively brief. Let's see. One share. Okay, so we basically have implementation for our selectable and clickable cards. Right here we have our new basically like multi-selectable. We just call it selectable though. You can see that you click anywhere in the card and it'll select, deselect it. Same thing will apply for our single selectable. Just if you click one, selects it. If you click another, it's like a radio. It'll deselect the old one, select the new one. And we have a clickable, which you can have this be either some sort of actionable trigger, like if you click it, open up like a primary detail drawer, or you can have it redirect externally like a link. So this one will, I think it's just like console log something, so you won't see it right here. But clicking on it, it'll trigger something, and then this one, if I click it, it'll navigate, or it should navigate. That might be prevented for like example purposes, but Those are a couple of things you could do with the new clickable. And then we have a clickable and selectable, which takes best of both worlds into one thing. The main thing to keep in mind with our new implementation is that if you want both, you really shouldn't have any sort of like nested interactive elements going on. So with a clickable and selectable, the whole card can no longer be like clicked or selected for like whatever purpose you want. We only have the checkbox here to select it via that. And then for this card, we have just a button for the title for some sort of actionable trigger. And then for the second card here, same sort of deal. Only the checkbox can be clicked. And then within the body of the card, we have this link added in, as opposed to the whole card acting as a link or a trigger or some sort of selectable activity going on. So I'll think of several of our examples further up. See if I can find one real quick. Yeah, like this is using, I believe, our actions prop still. So this functions similarly to our new clickable selectable. It's a separate checkbox toggle and kebab action going on. Our new implementation has a new prop called selectable actions, which will just render everything inside the card header for you. And I think that's about the most important things, at least for the new implementation.
Great, thank you. All right, I'll share some slides again, but we'll pass it over to Sarah to talk about what is coming up. Here we go.
Great. So as Nicole mentioned, we're going to be doing quarterly releases. So in quarter 3, we are planning on implementing support for right to left languages. So let's flipping everything around. So we'll be switching to using logical properties rather than directional properties. So for example, using inline start and inline end instead of left and right for things like margins and paddings and borders. This is something that's been in PatternFly discussions for a little bit, and a couple of products expressing interest. And we're really grateful to the cockpit team for bringing this to the forefront and for sharing their knowledge with us. So thank you very, very much, Garrett and Katerina. That was really, really helpful to collaborate on that. We've begun implementation, and we anticipate including this in the Q3 deliverable. If you want to go into the next slide, as you've probably heard or may have heard, there's a fresh coat of paint coming as well. So we're looking ahead to our next major release, where we will not only be adopting the new Penta look, but we'll also be adopting a new theming layer and design tokens. We're going to have a tighter coordination between the design kit and the PatternFly code. It's going to give us easier theming. It's going to give us dark theme baked into the design right from the start. We did have a hackathon at the end of June. I've lost what month it is. End of June, I think. There's a link there to the demo, but I have a couple of slides of screenshots. If you go to the next slide, there's a little sneak peek. You can see there's a little bit of a visual refresh there too. You're going to see some more rounded corners. Basically, for the most part, everything's in the same place, but there is definitely a refresh to the look. And if you go one more slide, see the dark version of that. And as I said, it's going to be baked right in and all token based. So that will be very exciting. And you'll have to come back to see more.
All right. That's the end of the long slide deck for today. So thanks everyone for hanging in there and for all your patience and support and contributions to PatternFly 5. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I think there's a decent chance that we will begin moving our community meetings to kind of match our quarterly release cadence. So I'll probably make an official announcement about that to the list so that people aren't too surprised. But yeah, there's your heads up. And if you're not on the PatternFly mailing list, I should add a link to this. I don't have a list, but I don't have a link at the moment at the top of my fingertips for the new slide deck. But feel free to send me an email if you're not on the list and want to be. How's that? All right. I'll send out the recording from this meeting and the slides with all their links to the list after and posted in the Slack channels after we wrapped up. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you at our next community meeting.